All right, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Great to be together. Welcome if you're a guest among us, particularly. It's so great to have you. If we haven't met, I think I have met everyone in this room, but my name is James. I have the huge privilege of leading a team here at Church for the City. It's great to be together today. Hey, who went to the beach yesterday? Anyone go to the beach yet this weekend? A few people. It's definitely beach season, or it feels like that. Not just because of how good the weather has been this weekend, but if you've been to the beach recently, or if you go to any beach at the moment in Sydney, you'll notice that it's beach season because the red and yellow flags are up. Everyone know to swim between the red and the yellow flags? Good, because I'm a volunteer lifesaver at my local beach, and I want to have to rescue you. No, so when I was, I volunteer once every 3 weeks as a lifesaver, and when I was doing my accreditation, my bronze medallion certification, anyone got a bronze medallion here, by the way? Oh, great, good. You want to volunteer on Saturdays once every 3 weeks? Okay, all right. Suspected not. When I was doing that accreditation, we went to another beach just down the road from us, and we were doing our kind of scenarios, our first aid scenarios where we were getting tested on them, and a real life rescue situation happened in front of us. We saw this guy go outside of the red and yellow flags, and he walked out in kind of waist-deep water and then chest-deep water. He was getting buffeted by the shore break, and he didn't look super confident, just the way he was sort of skipping over waves like that. It was like, you don't look like you've been in the water for a long time. Anyway, he got washed off the bank into like a deeper channel and clearly was struggling to keep his head above water. And so one of the lifesavers grabbed one of those big rescue boards and kind of David Hasselhoff down the beach and jumped in and took a couple of strokes, and then he got hit by a shore break and knocked back on his back, and he grabbed the board again and he pushed through the next wave and then got hit by the next one and knocked back. Then he tried a third time and got knocked back again and picked up his board and walked back to the tent. It was not a great advertisement for, Surf Rescue Australia in that moment. But fortunately, the guy got washed out of the channel into some shallower water and made his own way back in. So like crisis averted. But as trainees, we're watching this thinking, I think that's an example of what not to do in that moment. The point is, it can be really hard to push through shore breaks, especially with one of those really big, cumbersome boards. I'm a surfer. Sometimes I take people who are learning to surf out. Anyone here want to learn to surf? I'm not your guy. No. And one of the most challenging things, there are lots of challenging things about surfing. One of the most challenging things, though, is just paddling out and just paddling against the current. You're using muscles you don't usually use, and there's a whole lot of force you're not expecting. It can be really hard to swim against the current. And if you were here last week, then you'll know that we have started a preach series on the book of Daniel, which we've called Against the Flow. Now, we nicked that title from a guy called John Lennox and his book entitled Against the Flow, but also because we felt like one of the key things God wants to say to us and speak to us through this series is that it is possible to shine and thrive in a world that can sometimes feel like it's getting increasingly dark and increasingly hostile. It is possible to shine and thrive even when you've got to swim against the current, against the tide, or against the flow. I had a boss when I was working for a business consultancy a number of years ago who one of his favorite sayings was, James, if you're going to swim against the tide of modern conventional thought, you better make sure that you're right. And I guess what we're going to hopefully learn from Daniel and his mates is that these guys were able to, with strength and conviction, be prepared, often at great risk to themselves, to swim against the flow. They often did that. And they gave this unequivocal, courageous expression of what they believed to be right, to navigate that shore break, to swim against the current, to swim against the tide, to swim against the flow. So if you are new to us today, you are jumping in at a great time because all we've done is looked at a bunch of context. That's what we did last week. I'm going to be picking up on chapter 1 in Daniel today. And so just to bring you up to speed here, what has happened so far is that the people of God have been taken into exile from their homeland, and the temple has been pilfered. It's been robbed. The artifacts of the temple have become spoils of war. And you can read about this, by the way, not just in Daniel 1, which we're going to be looking at, but you can also read about it in 2 Kings 24. So that chapter also shows us a little bit of a summary of what happened during that time. If you've got a Bible with you, why don't you open up to both 2 Kings 24 and Daniel 1, because we're just going to dip into 2 Kings 24 very quickly. But we're going to pick it up in verse 2 of chapter 1 of Daniel right now. And it says this, "And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia." Now, sometimes Sorry for pausing after one verse, kind of what I do. We just get momentum and then I stop abruptly. Sometimes when we're reading verses that are really familiar to us, especially stories that are really familiar to us, we skip over things really quickly. But this is a super intense verse. A super intense verse. Let me read the first few words slowly for us to highlight how intense this is. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. That's Nebuchadnezzar's hand. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim into King Nebuchadnezzar's hand. It's not that the people of God were overpowered. It's not that King Jehoiakim was outwitted by Nebuchadnezzar's military strategy. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And you might think, well, maybe that's just the language that the author of Daniel chose to use. What does it say in 2 Kings 24? Let's flip to that if you've got it there with you. 2 Kings 24 says, surely these things happened to Judah according to the Lord's command in order to remove them from his presence because of their sins. So this is like a spiritual exile that is going on for the people of God right now. It's a spiritual exile that's a direct result of their sin and is an act of God himself. And like, that's heavy. We're in verse 2 right now. That's a super intense, heavy verse for us. And you might remember, if you've been a part of this church family for a while, that we looked at the book of Jonah some months ago. And if you remember the story of Jonah, he's on the run from God. He doesn't want to go to Nineveh. And so he jumps on a ship boarded for, anyone remember where it was going? Tarshish, very good. And that's extra points for you. Or tithing credits, as Justin said yesterday. He jumps on a ship bound for Tarshish. And then it says that God intercepted him by what? Sending a storm. God sent that storm. Now, there's nuance around that. Whatever that means, it means that God is present in the storm and that there is purpose in the storm. If God sent it, that has to be the case. I was talking to somebody during the week about like the extent of God's sovereignty and whether it's like appropriate to use language that God is in control of everything. Because if God is in control of everything, if he controls everything, then by extension, he's responsible for everything, including tragedy and pain and suffering as well. So when we say that God's in control of, is like, what do we mean by that? And we were talking about how there's obviously other factors, influences at play in the life that we experience. Once heard somebody summarize it like this, with these three things: in sin, the world, and the devil. These three things impact, obviously, our lives. And so sin, we realize here in 2 Kings 24, sin was the result, was what caused Israel's exile. That's what it said in 2 Kings 24. Sin was what caused their suffering. Sometimes it's a direct result of our sin that we end up in that sort of place. But sometimes it's just the state of the world, because the world's broken. Sin broke the world. And so we live in a state of not everything is as it should be. Sometimes it's sin, sometimes it's the world, and sometimes it's the devil, because we battle not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities. There's very real activity of the enemy, of the devil and his minions. And he works constantly to cause chaos and confusion and death and destruction and despair. That's what he does. And so sometimes what we experience in this life is a result of that. What the people of God, though, have experienced here is a spiritual exile, a direct result of their sin and at the Lord's hand. And that's a really big deal. It's a big deal also what's happened for them in terms of coming out of Jerusalem and what has happened to the temple. It's a really big deal as well, because the people of God thought that where they were and what God was doing was like the end place. Like that was where that God was going to rule from Jerusalem, that from the temple he was going to usher in this time of peace and prosperity for all people. That's what they were expecting and anticipating. So when Jerusalem gets burnt to the ground, and when the temple's artifacts end up getting taken, not just out of the temple as spoils of war, but into the temple of another God, it is utterly devastating for the people of God. And like, it's hard for us to fully grasp that and comprehend that, because we don't think about the temple and Jerusalem in the same way. We kind of think, oh, well, what's the big deal? And I think for us, it's because we don't view worship as tied to a place anymore. We don't view God's presence even as tied to a place anymore. It's different. We understand when Jesus died and that curtain was torn in two, we have access into the Holy of Holies because of what Jesus did and achieved. We have the Spirit dwelling within us. And so we know, like we regularly say, we don't go to church. Church is not a building. We are the church. We are the people of God. We regularly say those sorts of things. But for the people of God at the time, the fact that Jerusalem, this holy place, was in ruins and that the temple had been desecrated, that was a massive deal for them because how were they meant to worship God anymore? How were they meant to commune with God anymore? Where were they meant to offer their sacrifices? The means by which the bridge between them and God had been mended was eradicated. They no longer had that. So how were they meant to relate to him anymore? And I can imagine they would have been thinking like, what has gone on here? Lord, like you brought us out of Egypt. We were slaves in Egypt. You brought us out of Egypt. You led us on this journey through the wilderness for a bunch of time, and then we finally made it into our long-awaited promised land. You led us into that thing. You gave us victory over the nations that were there. We were able to build the city of Jerusalem and the temple. We followed your instructions about how the temple was to be built, and then it's all been burnt to the ground. We thought that was the finishing place. We thought that's what you were all about, what you were doing, what you were building. And it would have left big questions, I'm sure, in their mind. Are we still on the winning team? We'd gone all in on God. Is he still who he says that he is? Verse 3, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility. Verse 4, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. Now, this is part of the Babylonian colonization method, if you would. They would kind of skim the top off the nations that they had conquered, and they would take the best and the brightest, and they would indoctrinate them into the culture of Babylon. It was like this 3-year crash course in how to be a good Babylonian. And the idea was that as the conquered people looked to their former leaders and nobility, they would go, oh, well, they're okay with Babylon. Maybe we should be okay with Babylon too. It's kind of a way of undermining the will of the people so they wouldn't revolt. They just get assimilated into Babylonian culture, if you will. Verse 5 says, the king assigned them a daily amount of food even and wine from where the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, it says. Skip on to verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused, there's God's hand again, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you. So there's this bit of kind of dramatic tension going on here. The king wants to be viewed as generous. He wants to be viewed as really kind. He's like, hey, eat at my table. You can eat my food. You can drink my wine. If you refuse, you'll die. So there's kind of weird tension that exists with the king here. But Daniel and his crew are saying, we don't want to defile ourselves by doing that. And you might think, I think we've got at least a couple of vegetarians and vegans in the room. The rest of us are probably wondering, what's the big deal, though, about eating the meat, the king's meat? What's the big deal? Jesus turned water into wine. What's the big deal about the wine? Why was that defiling himself, Daniel defiling himself by partaking? It might have been because that food had been sacrificed to idols, and so Daniel was like, I don't want to go there. Or it might have just been that eating it, receiving that food and wine was like a symbol that you were bowing to the king. And it's like, again, not bowing to that king. Either way, Daniel's saying, I don't want to defile myself by doing that. But it's incredibly risky. It's an incredibly risky ploy because the king wants to be seen as generous, and he wants to be seen as rich and as powerful. And if you're his subjects, he doesn't want you looking all scrawny and unhealthy because you've not been partaking of his food. That doesn't reflect well on him. And so he wants his officials to look healthy, to look well-fed, to look rosy-cheeked, to look full of life. That's what he wants his officials to be looking like. And so Daniel's got this choice. Does he follow the God who sent him into exile? Or does he follow Nebuchadnezzar, who seems to be holding all the cards? And like Nebuchadnezzar is trending right now. Like God's on the down. Nebuchadnezzar is like, everything seems to be happening in his favor. Seems to be victorious. He seems to hold all the cards. He seems to be the one who is in powerful. And Daniel's having to ask himself, am I going to be the God who is in charge of my suffering? Am I going to follow that God? Or am I going to follow Nebuchadnezzar, who seems to be in control of my promotion? What am I going to do? He's torn. Do I fit in? Or do I stand out? Do I speak up? Or do I remain silent? Do I identify and address areas of injustice? Or do I just try to keep the peace? It's like a question and a tension that we're regularly faced with, right? What do I do in this moment? Do I want a comfortable existence? Or do I follow my conscience and do what I really, truly believe to be right? And Daniel, he chooses to align himself with the God of the exile and not the empire. But Daniel says, like, to the official, I get it. I know that you're in a really tough spot. I don't want this to look bad on you. And so he says, just test us. Just test us for 10 days. Let us eat broccoli. Let us drink water. If things look really bad after 10 days, we'll switch. Like, just test us. And I think it's ironic for me when I think, has anybody actually heard of the Daniel diet? Don't put your hand up if you've done the Daniel diet. Anyone, you've heard of the Daniel diet? Here's what I find hilarious about this, right? What Daniel is not saying here in this moment is, look, we could all do with losing a few. So how about we just eat some broccoli and drink some water for 10 days? That'll make us look a little bit more trimmed. Like, that's not what he's saying. We take the Daniel diet and we say we could do with losing a few. How about we just eat some vegetables, drink some water for a period of time? The funny thing to me is if you know the end of the story, if God honors that diet the way he honored it for Daniel, you're going to miserably eat vegetables and drink water for a period of time and end up putting on weight. Like that's what happens for Daniel. Yeah, we say, hey, we're going to do the Daniel diet. That's a really good idea. Anyway, it says, I think it's funny. Verse 15 says, though, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Verse 16, so the guard took away their choice food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables and said, I'm sure Daniel and his mates were super popular among the other young men at that point. The question that's on the table here is, who's really in charge? Is it Nebuchadnezzar or is it God? And who's Daniel going to trust? Is he going to trust the God who sent him into exile, or is he going to trust the king with all the trappings of the empire? And Daniel, he chooses to trust God, which is wonderful, and God honors him for that. He's rewarded for that. But up until that point, we don't know how it's going to go for Daniel. Like we don't know. Daniel probably wasn't 100% sure how it was going to go for him either. So I was reading the story this week. It reminded me of another story in the Old Testament. You know, Joseph, Technicolor Dreamcoat guy, know that story in Genesis? Similar kind of story in that he was taken off into captivity as well. He was sold as a slave into captivity in Egypt. And then we find out at the end of his life, at the end of Genesis, there's this verse that says, others meant it for evil, but what God meant it for good. And so like we realize that all that happened to Joseph, God was across that as well. Like God was in charge of that as well. Like God meant it for good, what was happening in that situation. And there's also this like interesting testing moment for Joseph as well with Potiphar's wife. I don't know if you remember that part of the story. He's tempted, or Potiphar's wife wants to take him off into her bedroom, and he resists that temptation. He passes the test. What ends up happening for him? He goes down further into the dungeon. Things don't go well for him. Even though he passes that test, he ends up worse off than what he was. So we don't know what Daniel's mates are going to, in a few chapters' time, end up getting thrown into a fiery furnace. You probably remember that part of the story. And there's this line where they say, our God will deliver us. We believe our God will deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we still we don't know for sure. Daniel didn't know for sure. He didn't know exactly how it was going to turn out for him, but he chooses to trust God anyway. And as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we don't follow him because he promises us health and wealth and a comfortable lifestyle. Like, that's not the reason that we follow him. He did say that if you follow me, you will have life and life to the full. But he also said, you got to pick up your cross. And he also said, in this life you will have trouble. And he also said, the world hated me and they'll hate you because they hated me first. He also said those things. And so I think what God is teaching Daniel here, and by extension what Jesus says to us, is it's better for you to trust me and eat vegetables. It's better for you to do that, even if it means death, because death with me ultimately leads to resurrection. Like, there's reward. There is a reward for choosing Jesus. There's a reward for choosing him and honoring him and obedience to him. Reminded me also this week that Jesus was faced with a similar test in his life as well. In a sense, like Joseph, like Daniel, he was sent into exile, but into exile among the Romans. And there's a time in Jesus' life where he's offered food as well, and he has to make a choice. Am I going to eat that? Satan offers him food in the wilderness. He's starving, 40 days without food. He's offered a choice. Do you want to starve in the wilderness with God, or do you want to eat with the king of the world and worship Satan and rule with him? So I'd rather starve in the wilderness with God. Thanks very much. Jesus passes the test. Jesus passes the test in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's like, oh, I'd love for this cup to be taken from me, but not my will, but your will. Ultimate test he's facing there. And Jesus passes that test. He trusts that death with God's plan is better than life without it. It's hard. Oh, what a test. But that's what he chooses. He chooses God. And I think kind of might seem dramatic, I realize, but I think that's kind of really what it is to be a Christian. It's to look at the empire of the world, and it's to look at all that it offers, and to know that if you refuse it, it could mean death for you in some way, but to choose God anyway, to choose to honor him and to follow the one who sent us into exile. And it happens like all the time in life. There's all sorts of situations where it happens for us. You might be in your place of employment. You see somebody doing something that they shouldn't be doing, something that's not integrous, something that's not legal, whatever it might be. And we're faced with a choice. Like, you might know that if I speak up about this thing, it's going to kill any chance of promotion for me. If I speak up about this thing, it might alienate me in the team or within my company. So we have to choose. Do we eat the meat? Do we drink the wine? Do we tip our hat to the king of Babylon? Is that what we do? Do we say, we want a comfortable life? Or do we risk consequences for speaking up in that moment? It happens. You might have somebody who's like done you tremendous harm, who's wronged you at some point. And the world might say it is fine to hold that against them. It's fine to wish them evil. It's fine to not pursue peace or reconciliation, whatever that might look like. I'm not talking about throwing yourself back into a space of harm, but it's fine to wish them evil. And Scripture says that your attitude should be like that of Christ Jesus, to do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but rather in humility, consider others more important than yourself. But we're confronted with these. We look at something, we think, oh, I like that. I want that. Look at someone, could I maybe, would anyone know? Would it really cause that much harm look, it's only a white lie. What's the damage? You could ask the question, James, what do you think about this sort of position? What do you think? What's your position on this thing here? Like, do I obey conscience and want to believe the Bible to say on this thing? Or do I fear the reaction that I might get for saying what I honestly feel about that thing? We're confronted with challenging situations in life. I think sometimes though, like the best way to make a difference is actually to be different. It doesn't make it easy. I think that's sometimes what we're called to. But I do believe like that this story, Daniel's story, is proof if you obey God's commands, there is honor in that and there is reward in that. There's all sorts of challenging decisions we get called to make in life. Where does our authority lie there? There's all sorts of complex cultural issues that we're wrestling with. Where do we start for the truth? Where do we go to for the answers? All sorts of complex and controversial issues. I heard someone say this week that the reality is if you believe that God raised Jesus from the dead, if you believe that, you already believe the most controversial thing about Christianity. You already do. And so like you're already out on a limb. Bad news for you. If you believe that, if you believe Jesus rose from the dead, you're already far out there. So when it comes to the other controversial issues, what do you have to lose in a sense? I do believe that God honors those who fear him enough to put him first. But what is the promise? What is the reward? What is the hope? I think that there is an ultimate hope. There's an ultimate eternal resurrection that we will enjoy as those who follow and love Jesus. There is that. But I think that there's also these other like mini resurrections that Daniel experiences in his life as well. These little mini rewards along. This exiled Jew ends up becoming prime minister. Like that's crazy. It's crazy when you realize kind of what happens actually in his life. Now, our life can be filled with all sorts of little resurrection moments if we choose to like, okay, I'm going to eat the broccoli too. I'm going to drink the water too. I think our lives can be filled with all sorts of little resurrection moments. One of the most encouraging things for me about yesterday was hearing Josh's testimony about how he's put God first in his workplace and all the amazing things he is seeing God doing. Now, it won't always happen that way, but I loved hearing the encouragement of the reward that he's enjoying, that little mini resurrection moments that he is happening. God's more powerful than we think. Even when it feels like the world's against us, he's more powerful than whatever circumstances we might be going through. What did Daniel's reward look like for passing the test? Again, we're in chapter 1. It says this in verse 17, that he was given knowledge and understanding. That was part of his reward. It says in verse 20 that he was found better. In fact, it says 10 times better than all the other magicians and enchanters. I'm not sure what 10... I like that he fasted with broccoli and water for 10 days and he was 1 times better than all the other for every day that he fasted with broccoli and water. I don't know if there's some symmetry there happening, but I like that. Verse 21 says that he remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Now we'll find out that he lasts through 3 successive empires. Can you imagine being chief advisor to whoever is in charge for 3 successive empires over the course of 70 years in your life while you're in exile, while you're technically one of the slave class? Like that's what happens to Dan. Nobody gets to be in Turnbull's cabinet and then ScoMo's cabinet and then Albo's cabinet. Like that doesn't happen, right? Much less if Indonesia invaded and then China invaded and you get to be in Joko Widodo's cabinet, you're an advisor to him, and you're also an advisor to Xi Jinping. Like that doesn't happen. Nowhere else does that happen. But that happens for Daniel. 3 different empires over the course of 70 years. He gets a seat next to power his entire life because he laid down his life like Jesus did. It's remarkable. Where do we go? Confronted with a challenging decision to make. If I make this decision, it could impact me in that way. What do? Got this controversial issue. How do I handle that? What do I think about that? Where do we go for our authority? What is our starting point? What is the authority for all these questions about life and world and meaning and morality? We're going to take God at his word? Or do we just go to some modern day philosopher? Watch some YouTube videos. Even YouTube videos of famous theologians. I'm totally guilty of this. I'm not proud of it. But when faced with controversial issues, I used to think, what does Tim Keller think about this? I'll just go along with him. That's not courageous. It's just lazy. I think sometimes we can be guilty of holding on to traditions without actually exploring, what does God say about this thing? What's God's heart in this area? Let's go, what does he think? What does she think? What did they say? I'll just adopt that. Where do we go for our authority? Because it's all a question of authority. And what I mean by that is, I think the reality is that we'd all rather rule in some way. We'd all rather be in control. We'd all rather be the boss. We'd all rather be in charge in our life in some way. And the world would tell us it's far better to be in power than to be under a power, to have the authority rather than have to submit to the authority. And of course, autonomy is more fun than servitude, right? And by the way, it's not a comment about whether you're a leader in business or a leader in industry or something. We want more people who know what it is to be under authority as well as in authority in the world. So it's not a comment about whether you happen to lead in your chosen workplace. But who's really in charge of our lives? Where does the authority sit in our lives? Because the thing is, heavy is the head that wears the crown. We have in the person of Jesus a perfect leader, a perfect king who works perfect justice every time, who provides, who protects, who promises resurrection life, who invites us to sit at his table, who calls us friends, who calls us family. We get invited into that kingdom. And I think I'd rather be a citizen in that kingdom than try to rule it myself. Wouldn't you? I don't want that pressure. I don't want to wear that crown. He's a perfect leader. So don't I want to serve in that kingdom rather than try to lead it myself? And this week, whatever your week looks like, I'm sure that you'll be confronted in some way with some sort of challenge. A challenging decision to make. Do I confront that? Do I address that? Do I speak up in that situation? Some sort of controversial issue that gets raised, that gets spoken about. Do we just stay silent? Do we keep the peace? Do we protect ourselves? Or do we run the risk of some sort of consequence, but choosing to honor God in the process? I think we want to put Daniel first like God did. I want to put Daniel first like God did, regardless of what the earthly consequences are. I want to believe that he'll empower us to do that. I want to believe that he'll reward us and honor us for doing that. And that reward and that honor, it might come in an ultimate way at the end of our lives, but I also believe it comes in smaller ways in the here and the now as well.